Good morning, Keith. Welcome.
Hi, Nicole. How are you?
I just really want to jump right in. I've told you before, I think that your work is so fascinating. A quote on your website is driving success through people and technology. So let's just start with a little bit about who you are, who SuSeWi is, and what was that big idea moment for you that became the driving force behind everything that you've done?
Thanks, and thanks for hosting me. The starting point was my partner. My partner is a biochemist and a biophysicist. He has learned about algae and photosynthesis his whole life. He's in fact just written a book about photosynthesis. And he approached me some years back with this crazy idea of growing algae on a very big scale. And he asked me to join him. And my first question to him was, well, what's algae? And he then spoke at me for about 3 days without taking a breath about all of the wonderful things that algae could do. And I'm motivated by doing good in the world and having an impact on the planet and its people. And I was really drawn to this idea of this magical ingredient that has created the atmosphere in which we can breathe and live. That is the biggest source of food on the planet. And that is, in fact, the original source of life. We were, once algae, I guess. So he unlocked this technology. He'd invented this technology to grow algae on a very large scale. And he asked me to join him from the business point of view and say what we could do with it and how we could attack the markets for the products that algae could deliver. And, it took no time at all for me to leave my job and to join him in creating this new enterprise.
And a very big adventure it turned out to be. I also see here it started with 3 square meters of experiment. And now your facility in Morocco is 30,000 square feet. So I want to say that again for our listeners. It started with 3 square meters, and now we're at 30,000 square meters. So inevitably, you must have had some bumps in the road and some rough waters. And like I said, we talked to a lot of innovators, a lot of people sitting there with that big idea. So what is something maybe in the beginning that you experienced that just didn't work out? And how did you respond to it to really allow it to propel you forward to the time now when you're experiencing so much success, which really is just on the horizon of so many industries and implementations? But how did that failure, in essence, propel you forward?
So when we started off in South Africa, which is where I'm from originally, actually. We were doing work with the Minister of Science and Technology there to work with the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, and we did our early experimentation there. And once we proved that it would work in the real world, we then started to look at where we could get a site to situate one of these full-scale farms. And when we're talking about full scale, it's an order of magnitude bigger than the numbers you've mentioned. So we now have a 6,000 hectare site in Morocco.
Amazing.
And in fact, one of the very difficult stages of this all was to get all of the approvals at a governmental level. And we've worked now with 3 different governments: the South African government, the government of Oman, and the government of Morocco. And these are big areas. It's quite complex. We need a lot of regulatory approvals. We need environmental approvals. We're putting a pipeline into the sea. There is a lot of collaboration across different institutions in countries. So that's, in fact, been a very, very hard part. The technology itself, we built the site that you can now see on screen in 6 weeks flat. But in fact, to get the approvals took a very long time. So what we've discovered is, in fact, is that the people side of the business is much more complex and slow than the technology itself. And that's actually very possibly, when you speak to a lot of founders, that is the harder side.
Well, no wonder you have the word people then in your slogan on your website. It's certainly, you couldn't do what you're doing without them. I know that everyone is thinking, this sounds great. We want something that is sustainable and natural. But I can guarantee you people right now are thinking, but you expect me to eat algae in order for this to work. So let's get into a little bit about what it is, why it is so healthy, and the amazing impact it can have on the environment.
Okay. So when you think about it, humans are very used to eating vascular plants, land plants. And land plants, there's about, we grow about 3 billion tons of land plants every year to feed ourselves. And if you take the totality of land plants, vascular plants, it supports roughly 160 million tons of animals on Earth every year. Mm. In the sea, phytoplankton or algae supports 900 million tons of life. So it's got 5 times more carrying capacity in the sea than all of the land plants combined. So we're talking about the source of the greatest food source on the planet, in effect, which supports the most life on the planet. And that's what algae is. Algae is this 3.5 billion-year-old organism that figured out, one, how to absorb carbon and use it. Two, how to absorb nitrate, silicate, and phosphate and turn it into the world's healthiest food. Three, algae is the fastest growing organism on the planet. So, when we grow algae, we start off with a test tube on day 1, and by day 30, we have 10,000 tons. It's an incredibly abundant, unbelievably healthy food source. It's got all of the proteins, all of the amino acids. It's got EPA and DHA, which you don't get from anything else, all of the omega-3s. It's got astaxanthin, fucoxanthin, beta-carotene. It's this most amazing organism that I would dare to say, if there was only one thing on Earth that you could eat, it would be algae. And so it's this incredibly healthy thing that we don't know. As I said earlier, that we grow about 3 billion tons of vascular plants a year. The total global output of algae, microalgae per year, is about 30,000 tons. And so we've barely figured out how to use this most abundant food source on Earth.
It's important here to talk about, you call it nature's innovation. So really the technology that's fueling all of this rapid growth that your technology is encouraging, just talk about that for a minute, because this is the best part. But
yeah, for me too, actually. So Rafael, my partner's revolution was very simple. All of the other people who are growing algae go to a collection of algae and look for the stuff that they want. They might want protein, or they might want oils, and they find in that collection the algae which has got all of the oils or the proteins that they like. And they take that and they grow it in a test tube. They like what it's got, and then they take it out into the real world and try and grow it from there. They're usually growing it in fresh water. They add carbon dioxide, they add nutrients, they protect the algae in these very artificial environments. So they've taken an algae that doesn't belong in a place, put it in a medium it's not meant to grow in, and then create this very artificial growing environment. Right? And then they grow algae. So it's a high-cost, unscalable technology, for the most part, that characterizes the algae growing industry. What Rafael did was completely different. He said, the algae grow perfectly in the oceans by themselves. They use sunlight, they use seawater, they use wind. That's our name, SuSeWi. Mm-hmm. And they use carbon dioxide. And they do it perfectly well by themselves, using all of these free inputs. Why don't we scale down the ocean instead of scaling up a test tube? And he took this approach, which was be natural. In everything that we do, be natural, because nature does it perfectly. So we do not use genetically modified organisms. So if we're looking for high protein algae, we go out into the sea and we literally look for it. We look for the algae that has the highest protein. We find it. It's a little bit like looking for a needle in the haystack, but we found it, and we bring it back and we work with it. And we take that algae from that ocean, which is used to that water and that sunlight, and grow it in its location where it is perfectly adapted and can grow exponentially. We don't take the human shortcut of torturing nature to our purpose, right? Genetic modification, monocropping, growing things in the wrong seasons, and so on and so forth. What we do is we take a completely natural system and we work with it, and we unlock that system and we respond to it. We watch how it performs, and we adapt ourselves to the natural system. And that's a totally different philosophy from sustainability, which is all about we'll torture nature and then we'll offset our negative impact.
It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. Here at Talking Plant Protein, of course, that's our focus. There are a number of industries that can be impacted by the work that you're doing. Climate change, alternatives for plastic. But could you speak really just to the food industry and the implementations that you've seen thus far, and maybe that you think where it can go?
Well, where it can go, we can talk about for a very long time. And let me just talk a little bit about where we're starting. Algae is like a food portfolio. Inside of one algae can be beta-carotene, amino acids, lipids, oils, omega-3s, omega-6s, and protein, right? So there's all of these things within one single algae. So we grow this algae, and we can either use it whole, as an ingredient, and we can use it, for example, as a substitute for fish meal. We can feed fish. In fact, we have done it. We've finished the trials at the University of Plymouth, where they grew salmon and they grew trout using our algae instead of fish meal. And the salmon and the trout grew better on our algae than they did on the fish meal. They grew faster. There was less gut inflammation. There was better feed conversion ratio. So it was a really, really good ingredient for a fish. Similarly with humans, actually, there's less gut inflammation. It's a very, very healthy protein. So if you take something like a soy protein, soy will go through 21 processes before you get the protein, including 2 which involve poisons, right? Which they then have to wash out. So soy protein is really not very healthy for you. And algae goes through 1 separation step, completely natural, completely organic. And so it's a very, very clean source of protein for humans. And so that's the first use you can use. So that's the second use, actually. So the first is as a whole biomass. You can feed it to people. We eat it all the time. And to animals, fish, pets. The second thing that you can do with it is you can extract proteins. You could also extract the beta-carotenes, which are very healthy, obviously, and some of the astaxanthins, which are preservatives, natural preservatives. They put them in infant formula and the like, and the oils. So we can find EPA and DHA, which is very healthy for brain development, eyesight, and a variety of other things as well.
So I believe you call it a hatch accelerator. I hope I've got that right. Talk to us a little bit about you mentioned the exponential growth, but what about the morphology of the plant in general? Your website talked about it blooming. So give us a picture of what that looks like.
So algae is a single cell. It's actually a very complex single cell, much more complex than anything we've got in the human body, because it can swim, it can absorb light, it can reproduce. So there's all that going on in a single cell. And what the algae does is it fixes the nitrates, and it takes the sunlight and it photosynthesizes, and it creates very high levels of protein or lipids or whatever it is. It divides, and under the right conditions, it goes into this what's called an exponential growth phase. So what you can see there on the screen is a bloom, right? And when you look at it in the sea, you won't necessarily see the algae is there, but it's always there in some sort of dormant phase. But at a certain time of year, there's an upwelling from the sea where lots of cold, nutrient-rich water comes to the surface. And it's the time for the algae. It triggers the algae into this exponential growth state. And you can go from 20 kilograms to 10 million tons of food in 30 days. It's the most extraordinary thing. And it fixes huge amounts of carbon. So for every ton of food we make, we absorb 3.2 tons of carbon, right? So the algae absorb carbon, convert sunlight and carbon into food, and then die off again, go back into this dormant state and wait for the next moment. And this is happening in the seas all the time. So different algae bloom at different times, absorbing vast quantities of carbon and producing vast quantities of food. It's an extraordinary little cell.
It's truly fascinating, talking about unlocking its magic. What's next? What's next for you?
So there are two things. One is we're developing new foods out of it. So we've made this very lovely no-fish fish finger, and we've made some beautiful tasting vegan caviar, okay, because we've got the fish flavors. So there's nothing out there that quite tastes like, nothing vegan out there that tastes quite like our algae. And we've made some vegan biscuits and all sorts of other things. So we're starting to produce foods out of our algae, and we're a fantastic ingredient for human food. And that's the one strain of development that we're pushing really hard, is the new products that we can make out of it.
Is there a guess on time frame on when those food products will be available?
Well, that takes us to the second question. The second question is, now we're on generation 4 of the technology. We're about to build a big site. So we're raising Series B finance right now to build a large-scale site. And by large scale, I mean it'll be 600 tons of dry algae per annum, which we will put into these different foods and for different uses. And then from there, we scale up to, we've got enough land to produce 70,000 tons of dry algae product. So the two tracks we're working on the one side is developing additional human foods, and the other track is building our first large-scale site, which is the first of its kind in the world. And within a short space of time, we will be producing more than the rest of the world's algae output put together.
Well, and you basically answered my next question as well, which would be one of your wildest dreams at SuSeWi, what would it be? But I think you're on your way.
On our way, absolutely. So we're developing a licensing model. What we intend to do is license the technology out so that we can grow the company as fast as possible and roll the solution out across the world. We've identified about 15,000 kilometers across the world of where you can locate these systems, sufficient for tens of millions of tons of production. But we want to license the technology to people who want to use it for different purposes. And so what we want to do here in the end is not run the production systems, but to do product development, really, is to look at new applications for algae in food, in textiles, in plastics, alternative plastics, all biodegradable, all sustainable, carbon absorbing uses as well.
Knowing everything that you know, what can the regular consumer, a mom like me at home with 3 kiddos, what kind of choices can we make now to support the health of our families and our planet?
I think that there's a very, very fast shift towards sustainable plant-based foods. You don't have to be vegan at all, but I think making more intelligent choices about what you eat, about the circular systems, about disposable fabrics, disposable fashion. There are choices that we can make right now in our lives about what we eat and what we consume that can really contribute to the planet. And those signals are so important because they are signals that are listened to by the producers of the products, the retailers and the distributors of the products as well. And the faster we can make that shift as consumers, the more the producers will follow that shift. The last to catch up with that story, though, are the providers of capital. And so I think sending strong signals to the investors that they've got to shift out of fossil fuel based, they've got to shift out of dirty industries, and they've got to get into clean industries, the better that is. And I think consumers can send a very strong signal in that direction.
So before we wrap, I want to just go back. Tell us again your partner's name and the book that he just finished.
I'll grab it.
Awesome.
Oh, it's under my computer. Here we go. So this is, whoops, upside down. This is my partner, Rafael Javine, and that's his book. It's all about photosynthesis, really. And it's a very simple and easy to read book. It sounds like it's a very scientific, difficult to read book, but it's not. And it's really about how photosynthesis will save the planet. So I encourage everybody to go onto Amazon or everywhere else and get a copy.
All right, well, I will be checking it out. And also, tell us if there are any investors listening who really want to back this technology and what you're doing as you start to expand globally. And where can they reach you? What should we tell them if they want to get involved in that way?
I would love to hear from them. I mean, we've got a very good story for investors. We obviously are using sun, sea, and wind, all of which are free, to make food, which is very valuable. And so we've got a fantastic economic model. We're very profitable. We've got very good EBITDA because all of our inputs are free. And that's one of the advantages of working completely naturally. And so we're looking at very high returns on capital. We need somebody well, a group of investors who are willing to take this next step with us. We're looking for partners who can help us to build a company and who are patient. There's a whole industry which we can unlock out of here. And they can get me, well, I'm on LinkedIn, and they can just get in touch perhaps through that, or alternatively through our website.
Okay, great. Let me read you a quote by Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. It has been my honor, sir, to have you here in the Talking Lab studios. The environmental impact of the work you're doing is vital. We really appreciate your input this morning. So thank you for talking with us, joining us on Talking Plant Protein.